Chapter 25 of Banking Under Difficulties by George Ogilvy Preshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Chapter 25. In the early days of the Goldfields, and in out-of-the-way places, if there were not two full-blown lawyers to be had, mining advocates, as they were termed, were allowed to appear and plead the cause of their clients. On one occasion a court was being presided over by the commissioner, a rough and ready naval officer, who insisted upon deciding every case on equity principles, paying no attention whatever to legal quibbles, a rule that might be more applied these days with advantage. Mr. Smiler, mining advocate, commenced quoting Coke on Littleton, probably to show his erudition, but was immediately silenced by the worthy commissioner with, "Coke upon Littleton be damned! What did he know about Wharton's coats?" 5th February 1867. Returned from a trip to Fox's, now known as Brighton. Found people in a great state of excitement, news having been received that gold had been discovered in large quantities at the Haast River, situated 50 miles south of Hokitika. The SS Alhambra was put on the berth and soon filled. I made up my mind to go down and have a look at the place. A trip in a steamer such as the Alhambra was a treat to one like myself, who was accustomed to travel in small coasting steamers overcrowded with passengers. One of my trips to Woodpecker Bay, Brighton, I shall never forget. Fancy a small steamer, 110 tons register, crowded to excess with scarcely standing room on the deck. Safely over the bar, the purser commenced his pleasing duty of collecting the fares, which was done in this way. All hands were called aft. The purser stood at the gangway, and as each one passed through he had to pay his fare. Growls innumerable were to be heard on all sides. That, however, was of no avail. Many pleaded poverty. In that case the police flag was hoisted on reaching the port of destination. By the time the police boat came alongside, and oftentimes before, men who had refused to pay or pleaded poverty, etc., found sufficient for their fares. On this very trip one man swore he hadn't a shilling, would go to jail, etc., but on the police putting in an appearance, suddenly found he had something like 20 £10 notes in his pocket. I often pitied the pursers, who had anything but enviable billets. As dinner hour approached, quite a crowd gathered around the cook's galley, and as soon as the meat, potatoes, and bread were handed out, they were rushed and taken possession of by a few. I was seated on the bridge where I could see all that was going on. One man got a piece of beef 10 or 12 pounds in weight. This he divided amongst 4 of his mates, who took their respective junks and tore away at them, without either salt, pepper, bread, or potatoes, like so many dogs. A billy of potatoes followed. This was seized by a big, hulking fellow who helped himself plentifully and passed it on. Another man with an overcoat on I saw fill both his pockets. The bread was treated in like manner. This, with a plentiful supply of tea for all hands, formed the midday meal. In consequence of all this rushing, the majority had to go without. Had there been anything like discipline, there would have been plenty and to spare. As it was, the grub got into the hands of the few, who ate until they were filled, and what they could not eat they threw away. As a rule, the digger is quite as well behaved as any other man, but on this occasion I must say I was truly ashamed of the behaviour of some of them. Of course the cabin passengers were provided for and fared as well as could be expected. To proceed. On board the Alhambra one sat down in a comfortable cabin to a good substantial meal, which was exactly what I wanted, not having had anything worth eating for about a week. My friends Bonnard and Byrne accompanied me on this trip, which was rather enjoyable than otherwise, though we all had to do our share of roughing. Arrived at the Haast at 7 o'clock in the morning on the 7th, and after breakfast a few of us landed on one of the ship's boats. Not a safe thing to do as a rule on the coast, what are known as blind rollers often rising and swamping a boat. But Captain Turnbull, chief harbour master at Hokitika, having crossed the bar a short time before and pronounced it quite safe, we chanced it. Captain, or as he was generally called, Jack McLean, had his hands full with such a crowd on board, but owing to his good-natured jocular style, he kept the best of friends with them all. One man was particularly noisy. "By crumbs! he would do this and that. Just as our boat was hauling off, he jumped in with, "Bah, crumbs, Captain! You mustn't go off without me." The rest of the passengers were taken ashore by the steamer Waipara, which vessel had been sent down to tend to the ocean steamer. On landing, we found very little stir and an apology for a township, and on making inquiries, found the diggings were some 3 miles away. The miners doing fairly, but no pile claims. We hunted about till we found our friend Brougham, who had a small tent erected close to the one occupied by the R.M., Mr. Fitzgerald. Here we took up our quarters for the night, made up a bed on the cold, cold ground. About 2 o'clock in the morning it began to rain and blow. So hard did it blow that Byrne and I had to hold on to the pole inside and Brougham to the ropes outside. Meanwhile, our blankets got saturated. This style of thing lasted for about an hour. We had no medical comforts. What with woodlice, wet blankets, and want of PB, we were in a nice fix. However, we weathered it out until daylight, and of course sleep was out of the question. After breakfast, Mr. Cooper, the surveyor, started to mark off the township. No sooner did he put down a peg than down went at least a dozen alongside of it, each peg owner claiming that particular allotment. This lasted for the best part of the day, and gave plenty of work to the RM for a day or two after. Byrne and I took a walk round, hoping some charitably disposed individual would ask us to dinner. As no invitation came, and we were as hungry as hunters, we went to a store and purchased some ham and eggs, which we ourselves cooked and partook of there. I managed to secure a good tea at a storekeeper's named Mark's. Happening to drop in there promiscuous-like, I smelt something very like roast mutton. So I waited about until it was ready, when I received a hearty invitation to join them. This I was not slow to accept. After tea, I was standing at the store door doing the calumet of peace, when I saw 3 drunken diggers enter a shanty opposite. They called for drinks, which the landlord handed to them. They were leaving without payment, when he said, "Hold on, mates, I want 3 bob." One of the 3 walked back, and with his fist struck the landlord between the eyes. He objected to this style of payment, and pulled a revolver out of his pocket, which he presented at the fellow. The very sight of the revolver seemed to sober him, for he walked up and said, "Take my advice. Never draw your revolver unless you are determined to use it," and walked out of the place. I fully expected there would have been a row. When all was quiet, I walked over and remonstrated with him for acting as he had done. He said he knew he had acted wrongly in presenting the revolver, which he showed me, a proper pepper box so rusty that the barrel wouldn't revolve, but smarting under the pain of the blow and in the impulse of the moment, he scarcely knew what he was about. I visited the diggings next day, which we found about 3 miles from our camp. Nearly all were on gold, but no pile claims. I returned by the Bruce, a dirty little coasting steamer, the only advantage gained in travelling by her being that she could and would bump over the bar at any time when another vessel would not face it. We had a magnificent view of Mount Cook and the Francis Joseph Glacier. 9th July 1867. I was truly shocked to hear of the death of my old friend and brother officer Joe Yates, which melancholy event took place at Westport yesterday morning. The following is an extract from the West Coast Times. It is with sincere regret that we have to record the death of Mr. Joseph Yates, Inspector of Goldfield Agencies on the west coast of New Zealand for the Bank of New South Wales. Mr. Yates was a gentleman of great ability, and has, in a very great measure, contributed to the successful working of numerous Goldfields branch agencies attached to the Bank of New South Wales. Perhaps few can realise the hardships a branch inspector in the position that Mr. Yates occupied is compelled to undergo. Not only is he, in a great degree, held responsible for the success of any branch he may recommend to be opened, but he is called from one new goldfield to another at long distances asunder, frequently having to tramp the whole distance on foot in company of diggers, oftentimes sleeping hard and faring worse. We have known Mr. Yates, holding the high position of a confidential employé of the bank, being compelled for days altogether to take his meals under a calico covering, through which the rain penetrated as it would a sieve, and surrounded by the roughest of the rough, and to sleep almost anywhere he could find a vacant spot to lay his head down upon. Of course, this gentleman had to undergo no worse trials than others in similar situations of responsibility, but it certainly is not the pleasant, comfortable, and remunerative employment many people are apt to suppose. Mr. Yates used to say that although treated with all reasonable liberality by the Bank Directory, his expenses exceeded those allowed to the full extent of his income, and that without any extravagant indulgence. He was a gentleman widely known, deeply respected, and will be greatly missed. We subjoin an extract touching the death of Mr. Yates from the Westport Times. It is with sincere and profound regret that we have this day the melancholy duty of announcing the unexpected death of Mr. Joseph Yates, Goldfields Inspector of the Bank of New South Wales, but recently temporarily located here on the reopening of the Westport branch. The death of this gentleman has given quite a shock to the town, for he was universally respected by all who came in contact with him, and his honourable, genial nature endeared him to those who were intimate with him. No better friend to the miner was ever at the head of mining banking matters. No more charitable, kind-hearted man ever listened to a tale of distress, and none who told it were ever sent empty away by him. A more diligent or faithful servant no bank ever had, and we feel assured that the management and all who ever came in contact with the deceased gentleman will deeply share in the heartfelt sorrow that is felt in Westport at this unexpected death. He was taken ill only 6 days ago, with what were thought to be spasms, and was confined to his bed. Subsequently he became worse, and eventually was delirious, having only lucid moments for about 10 minutes on Sunday. He died about 3 a.m. yesterday morning, the only persons being present being Mr. Porter and Dr. Rockstro. I first met Yates at the Castlemaine branch of the Bank of New South Wales. From there he went to Malden, then known as Tarrangower. It was he who opened our branch there, and where he was stationed for some time. His next move was to Adelong in New South Wales, and from there he went to the Snowy River, Kiandra. He was for some time in Otago as a superintendent of goldfield agencies, and when the great rush to the west coast took place, he was removed thither. He was, as I once heard a friend of mine say, a man of rough exterior but of noble heart, a faithful servant of the bank, and a true friend to many. He was buried on the beach at Westport, and a plain but substantial monument was erected over his grave, the cost of which, £120, was readily subscribed in a short time by his numerous friends on the west coast. A much larger sum would have been subscribed, but the subscription was limited to £1 each, and the list closed as soon as the £120 was collected. In 1868, so much of the beach was washed away that it was found necessary to remove the body to the new Westport cemetery. The monument was taken down and re-erected over the spot which now marks the last resting place of my well-beloved friend. A curious case of attempted bribery occurred on one goldfield when I was on the spot. A dispute arose between two parties of miners. H party, claiming damages for encroachment, and K party admitting the encroachment, which they said was unintentional, but maintaining that the plaintiff H held too much ground. On the evening previous to the hearing of the case, H made his appearance at the warden's private residence, and requested an interview in private, which was accorded him. He then stated that his party wished to make the warden a present of £40. On being asked the reason, they said they knew he, the warden, was very poorly paid, and they wished him to accept the gift purely for friendship's sake. The warden, rather a vacillating person, but strictly honourable, did not know what answer to make. He had no intention of taking the money for his own use, but at the same time he wished to punish the men, so he asked H to call again in an hour. In the meantime, he consulted a solicitor, who advised him to take the money and advertise it in the next morning's paper as having been given to the hospital by H through the warden. This was done, and H had the satisfaction of reading in the morning paper that he had been a benefactor to the hospital to the extent of £40. H also lost his case. I was once staying at the Melbourne Hotel, Charleston, where there was a waiter named Mick. To what country he belonged I will leave the reader to guess. Mick acted as waiter and delivered his orders to the cook from the dining room to the kitchen through a slide in the wall. One day the warden came in to dinner, and Mick recounted the various dishes, amongst which was sheep's head and brain sauce, on which the warden decided. Mick roared out the order thus: "Sheepshead and brains for the warden." No one laughed louder than the warden himself. In the same Charleston was a character named Black Jamie. Jamie was engaged by the manager of the Union Bank to keep the premises clean and look after the place in the evenings. The manager supplied Jamie with a revolver and instructed him to keep watch, and if he saw any person prowling about at night, he was to challenge them 3 times, and if they did not answer, he was to fire. "All right, sir," said Jamie. "Suppose my own mother comes, sir. She not answer when I challenge, I bust her up like a carrot." It will not be surprising to learn that the disturbing element in British politics for many years should make itself felt in the Antipodes. After the execution of 3 fanatics at Manchester for the murder of the policeman Brett, a certain fanatic named O'Farrell at Sydney concealed a weapon on his person and maliciously fired at the Duke of Edinburgh. Fortunately, although the ball took effect, the result was only a temporary indisposition from which the Duke has since entirely recovered. At the trial of O'Farrell, his intention no doubt was to take the life of the Duke. The jury found him guilty, and he was duly executed. At the time of the disturbances on the west coast, the news from England brought accounts of the execution of the 3 fanatics at Manchester, also the outlines of the attempted assassination of the Duke of Edinburgh at Sydney. During the great excitement of party feeling, when leading citizens went about carrying arms and almost everyone wore a distinctive badge, the loyal and law-abiding had blue ribbons in their hats or coats. The Fenians, of course, sported green, and frequent minor collisions occurred, which resulted in free fights. The county police, a very fine, well-trained body of constables recruited from the Irish Constabulary, under the command of Inspector Brougham, did good and effective service, the inspector himself displaying evidence of great coolness and determination. On one occasion, single-handed, he walked into the room of a public-house where about 12 of the ringleaders of the Fenian party were assembled, and arrested the lot, and with assistance marched them to the camp and kept them in confinement. If this had not been done in the nick of time, who knows to what length these misguided people might have gone. The situation of the west coast is particularly favourable to the development of any disturbance of law and order, owing to the difficulty of access. At times, the entrance to the river from the sea is entirely blocked. In 1866, the bar was closed for 100 days. The road from Canterbury over the mountains, on which the mail coach runs twice a week, is in places exceedingly steep and difficult. No other approach is open except the sea beach, north and south, and there is great difficulty and danger in landing, even by surf boats. In such an isolated district, where several thousand Irishmen were scattered, of course a certain proportion of Fenians were sure to be found. It may be remarked in passing that the diggers on the west coast were as fine a race of men as could be found on any goldfield, well-grown, strong-bodied men, and generally well-behaved. Large meetings were held, inflammatory speeches delivered, and, sad to say, a priest of the Romish Church, who exercised great influence amongst the miners, did not fail to appear and aid by every means in his power to stir up dissension and trouble. Their exertions culminated in a mock funeral and a forcible entrance to the cemetery near Hokitika to plant a huge cross with the names of the supposed martyrs. This was effected on Sunday, 8th March, 1868, with bands of music and various devices such as IR, Irish Republic, Emmet, 'tis treason to love her, death to defend, etc. Previous to the trial taking place, a demonstration was made in favour of law and order. The Fenians numbered 800, but when the procession of law-abiding citizens rolled up, from Waimea and Stafford and other outlying towns, over 1,200 strong, it was easily seen what would be the result of a disturbance should the Fenians interfere with the peace of the district. Before the trial began, the affair was treated as a fiasco, but having been committed by the magistrates, they would have to go through the Supreme Court. Judge Richmond said the counts of indictment against the prisoners had been more carefully prepared than he had reason to expect in that remote district. He explained the law of treason and unlawful assembling. An eminent Melbourne barrister had been brought over specially to defend the prisoners. He raised points of law, some of which were allowed, and then made an eloquent speech on their behalf. Conviction followed. Father Larkin got a month for the celebration of mock masses, and was fined £20 for being in the procession. This and the other judgments were mild, and peace once more prevailed. On one of the rushes, no need to particularise, the warden, who certainly never ought to have been placed in such a position, was hearing evidence as to some mining dispute, and as too often happens, the 12 men forming the plaintiff's party swore diametrically opposite to the same number of defendants. This placed the poor warden in a dilemma from which he saw no means of escape, and he whiningly said, "How am I to decide this case? Here are 12 men swear one thing, and 12 others swear directly opposite." After some deliberation, a happy thought struck him, and he exclaimed, "I will call for a show of hands." End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Banking Under Difficulties by George Ogilvy Preshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Chapter 26. Truly, the banker of the old digging days was different to that curled darling Montmorency Fitzjones, idle at the block and much invited out of Potts Point. A slab hut, roofed with galvanized iron, formed but a sorry contrast to the palatial buildings in the cities, or the comfortable residences in the towns of the present day. As will have been seen, in many instances a tent was deemed sufficient in which to transact business of thousands per diem. The manager, too, had to be hail fellow well met, by no means too proud to go out and have a nobbler with the lucky seller of a large parcel of gold. Clerks did their work on hot days with their coats off, and on cold wet ones with hats and greatcoats on, and often a lighted pipe was a welcome solace while standing at the counter. What would a smug clerk of the Bank of England, who would probably faint at his counter or desk without the regulation dress coat, think of this? Scene: Country Bank. Dramatis personae: manager and assistant at counter in cabbage tree hats and smoking. Size of banking room 8 feet by 10 feet. Enter Luggy Dicker, lock. "I say, boss, what you giving for gold?" Manager: "Turn it out into this dish and let me have a look at it." Digger turns it out. Manager: "That's why mere gold. Can't give you more than £3 17 shillings an ounce." Digger: "That be blood. Why, the Bank of New Zealand's giving £3 18 shillings. Manager: "Not for why mere gold." At last a price is agreed upon, and the cleaning process commences. The gold is placed in a small copper scoop and is stirred round with a powerful magnet to clear it of any iron that may be amongst it. It is then carefully shaken up until any sand that may be in it is brought to the front. This is blown out, a sort of careful winnowing, in fact. By these means the gold is cleared from all impurities. I may explain to the entirely uninitiated that this only applies to alluvial gold. For that found in reefs, another and much more elaborate process is necessary. The copper scoop must of course be thoroughly dry, and so damp was the climate of the west coast that I had frequently to carry about with me a small stove over which the scoops were placed. A banker, again, is not usually the sort of man upon whom one would expect practical jokes to be played. The digger, however, reverences no one, as will be seen by the following little incident. Enter into the bank a digger. "I say, mister, how do you sell crinolines?" "What do you mean?" was my reply. "Well, old man, you needn't be so Scotty. Only when a fellow sees a crinoline hanging over the door, he naturally thinks they're for sale." I rushed out, and sure enough, exposed to the gaze of an admiring crowd was a prodigious crinoline that had been quietly hung over the door by my neighbour, Mr. B., a large storekeeper. There was nothing for it but to join in the laugh and endeavour to repay the joke, which I did, with interest, by misplacing some of his price tickets on his goods, and sending an irascible digger to purchase the cheap goods. "Let's have 4 pair of them moleskins, such as you have ticketed up outside." The trousers, whose ticket I had altered from 12 shillings to 4 shillings, were made up into a neat parcel, and 16 shillings duly deposited for payment. "Some mistake, sir," said B. "These moles are 12 shillings a pair." "Then what the sanguinary Sheol are those you have outside marked 4 shillings? Another dodge, I suppose. You don't Jew me, old man. Let's see him as is ticketed." B, of course, explains that he has none at that price, and when, after a rather heated discussion, he is dragged outside to see, he protests it's a mistake, etc. But this his customer won't see, and makes such a row that he is eventually allowed to go away with his cheap purchase. Next day I remarked to B that I heard he was selling moleskins cheaper than I could afford to sell crinolines. When a big, or in fact any account is now open, we all know that there is some small business-like work done. The signature is taken leisurely, and the whole transaction is methodically completed. One day, walking along the beach, I met Mr. K, of the well-known firm of K Brothers. "Just the man I wanted to see. You're Mr. Preshaw, aren't you?" "Yes," I replied. "I want to open an account with your bank. You may as well take the money now," handing me a deposit consisting of notes, gold and silver coin, which I transferred to my trousers pocket, at the same time making a memorandum of the transaction in my pocketbook. I bid Mr. K good day, and went on my way. On another occasion, I gave a man on the beach a deposit receipt on a leaf torn from my pocketbook. These and similar instances will show how implicitly anyone connected with banking was trusted in those days. Unfortunately, the converse would not always hold good. A favourite trick of the diggers was to endeavour to pass off gold from one part as having been obtained at another. The assays of the different diggings varied immensely, and while some gold was worth £3 18 shillings per ounce, that from other diggings might not be worth more than £3 12 shillings. However, after a little practice, one soon got used to these little tricks, and was astonishing with what ease one could place any particular parcel of gold brought in. I hardly think, however, that many of our colonials would have exhibited the same amount of gullibility as is shown in the following extract from the Banker's magazine. The London Banker and the Irish Mountain. In the flourishing seaport of Sligo, on the northwestern coast of Ireland, is celebrated for the boldness and beauty of its scenery. A short distance from the town there is a perpendicular or slightly sloping mountain called Ben Bulben, better known in Ireland than in England. About half a century ago, a trader in Sligo, more remarkable for enterprise than integrity, having exhausted all the legitimate and ordinary means of raising money, conceived the idea of floating fictitious acceptances, and with this object he forwarded to his English banker for discount several bills of exchange drawn on and accepted by Ben Bulben and Company. The London banker, not being acquainted with the acceptors, wrote to his Irish correspondent for his confidential opinion of the firm. The latter, well known for his humour and treating the inquiry as a joke, replied as follows. The parties inquired about are long resident in this locality, and are looked up to as the most extensive landholders in this district, possessing within their own limits the varied resources of rich pasture, turbary, and an inexhaustible supply of mineral wealth and an unrivalled water power. In character, Ben, the principal of the partnership, is what we call here a stiff-necked sort of fellow, and I have heard it said that if his cap were on he would not take it off to royalty. Although he is constantly imbibing Mountain Dew, a term often used to express illicit spirits, his steadiness is undoubted, and as to his stability it cannot be questioned. In fact, he is the principal of the chain of mountains which runs through this and the adjoining counties. This description, though meant as a joke, was actually considered by the London banker as a bona fide communication, and though the bills were actually drawn on Ben Bulben and Company, a mountain range near Sligo, they were actually discounted, and the manager of the bank, when the fraud was discovered, was compelled to resign. With all the apparent roughness and seemingly loose way of doing business, great care had to be exercised. And if some, accustomed to the strict discipline of the head office, rejoiced at the apparent slackness, they soon found that, though it was pleasant enough to have a yarn with a customer in the middle of the day, yet it was more than made up by having to get up, possibly at night, to buy a parcel of gold, or that riding on business was very nice, but when it came to your horse bolting, upsetting you, and leaving you to foot it some 10 or 20 miles, carrying possibly some 500 ounces of gold, it was not altogether so pleasant. How would some of my young juniors in Sydney like the following experience of a well-known officer, for the truth of which I can vouch, and which I give in his own words? In 1863, when acting as junior at Manaharikia Agency, situated at the junction of the river of that name with the Clutha, Mr. Yates paid a visit of inspection, on the completion of which he said, "Youngster, I will require you to accompany me to the Teviot to bring down cash and collect gold bought by our storekeepers." "What am I to ride, Mr. Yates?" "The grey, of course. I can get nothing else." This announcement was not very comforting to me, seeing that Sherman's Rough Rider had been entertaining the residents with his feats of horsemanship on this animal. I could ride, but not with the seat required to maintain one's position for on a buck jumper, and the grey could go in a docker when started. Quietly took my chance. The nag was brought out the following morning. All the good folk turned out to see the fun. Luckily for me, a friendly packer who was going with me said, "Leave your spurs behind, and don't touch her with your heels." Following his advice, I mounted. Yates had a twinkle in his eye, but my friend pushed his horse alongside of the grey, took a lead, and to my relief she followed without a kick. Our road lay over the knobby ranges, and when nearing a deep chasm or gorge about 3 miles from the Teviot, Yates, seeing my steed travelling as lively as a bag of fleas, said, "You take my horse, as you're a lightweight, and I will ride your mount." As we had to lead our horses up and down to cross this ravine, I took the lead with Yates' horse, and being young and active, I was up and out of it some time before my boss. The thought then struck me, if he rips his spurs into her, there'll be a kick up. I went ahead, keeping good lookout behind. I saw him mount, but the horse did not move ahead. Yates weighed over 16 stone and had a good seat, so I had no fear for him, therefore went on my way, reaching Ballantyne's store. Long after, in marched Yates, leading the grey, and speaking in strong language. He informed me that if I had remained he would have finished his journey on his own horse. I thought so too. After our supper of sardines and dry beard, I said, "Where am I to sleep?" "Anywhere you like, except in those 2 bunks, one being Ballantyne's, the other mine." Ballantyne said there was a tent outside with a flour bag stretched between 2 poles, and he gave me half a blanket. The night was bitterly cold, with heavy snow, and the place was swarming with rats, so that I was glad when daylight came. "What have you for breakfast?" I asked. "Tin of cold fish and bread." "I will try for something better in the township." I found a small shanty, and on asking if they could furnish me with a hot breakfast, was informed they could, and a good steak was the result, which I had hardly finished when the chief's rosy face appeared. "Hello, you here? What? Had breakfast? Landlord, get some ready for me." And a good comfortable tuck-in the old man had. We were now ready for work, and after riding many miles, visiting numbers of small stores, we took their various purchases, leaving cash for future operations. Night saw us back again at the wretched Ballantyne erection with 500 ounces of gold, which Yates slept on, while I went to roost with the rats. Next morning we started on our return journey, but with only 1 horse, as the grey belonged to a party at Teviot, and we expected to get a bank horse that was turned out at a place near Teviot. When we reached there, we found the horse could not travel. Yates determined to go on, ride and tie. The latter operation was effected with the aid of snow poles, which a thoughtful government had provided to guide travellers over this wild range. The snow was heavy underfoot and dense in the air, and we blessed these poles. As it was not safe to leave the gold on the saddle, on fastening the horse to the pole, the rider humped the gold till the mounted one overtook him and relieved him. Now 500 ounces of gold is a heavy handicap to carry in snow, and we did not reach Manaharikia until night. Here we borrowed a dray horse and journeyed on to the Dunstan township, Yates' headquarters, where we arrived late at night. This trip will give some idea of the exposure and peril which this devoted servant of the bank was always ready and willing to face in the interests of the great institution which he so well served. and will also illustrate the training which Mr. Yeats gave his juniors, which, though severe, was looked back upon with feelings of thankfulness by those officers who served under him. On reviewing my past life on the Goldfields, especially that part of it spent on the west coast of New Zealand, I wonder how I could have gone through the dangers and hardships I did. Nothing would induce me to go through the old life again. For the first 6 months of my stay on the coast I had no office. My safe was for a time at Waite's store, afterwards removed for convenience sake to the Terumaco. I was continually on the move, following the different rushes. I had no home. When at the Grey I had my meals and a bed at the police camp with my friends Brougham and O'Donnell. When on the move, had to do the best I could. Sometimes have a meal at a shanty. Sometimes purchase a tin of sardines and a few ship biscuits. Sometimes have a meal of seagull eggs, and so on. Once a week, my wife, who was living in Nelson, sent me a kerosene tin filled with homemade bread, cake, potatoes, and different sorts of vegetables, the only time we got any, none being procurable for love or money. These I took to the police camp and shared with my friends. I had to do my own washing and mending, a good deal of it too, my stock of clothing being limited, and the wear and tear being very great. One had to be extra particular as regards personal cleanliness in those days, for sleeping in all sorts of places and with all sorts of persons, one was apt to get more than he bargained for, in the shape of pediculus, humanus corporis. As to sleeping accommodation, I was fairly well off when at the Grey, but when on the move I had to sleep on the damp ground, a sack under me and my fly-bone blankets about me. I always slept in my clothes, boots, hat, and all. The saddlebags, containing gold dust, gold and silver coin, under my head for a pillow, the notes about my person inside my Crimean shirt, my revolver by my side. Oftentimes I have slept on the beach, on the log, just above high water mark. I chose this airy situation to escape those pests, the sandflies, mosquitoes, and bush rats. For the first month I had no horse, and had to do my journeys on foot, carrying a pair of saddlebags on my shoulder. On the up journey it was comparatively easy work, but on the return trip, with 500 or 600 ounces of gold dust, it was no joke. Such a road too. The first 10 miles beach travelling, then inland through dense bush with only a bridle track, almost impassable in wet weather. It would have been the easiest thing in the world for a man to have popped me off from behind a tree and dragged my body into the bush, where the chances are it would never have been discovered, and gone off with the treasure. Fortunately for me, the attempt was never made. Rivers had to be crossed in canoes and creeks on foot, in places waist deep. When I got a horse, my journey then on leaving the beach was up the river beds. On the Greenstone trip, the Terumaco had to be crossed no less than 4 times. The first and second fords were the worst, the bottom being very rough with large and slippery boulders and a strong current. The second ford was the most dangerous, the river being 10 feet deep in the middle for 10 or 12 yards, necessitating a swim. Each time I came to this ford, I looked at the opposite bank and wondered if I would be fortunate enough to reach it. My horse, good little Nobby, evidently knew the danger as well as his master. As we reached the ford, he would cock his ears and carefully feel his way until he found the water over his back. Then he would put forth his utmost strength, I keeping a gentle pressure on the rein and his head well upstream, until he regained his foothold. Poor little Nobby! He was a good and faithful servant. When I gave over my perilous journeys, he was sold to a butcher, and came to an untimely end, being killed by falling down a digger's shaft. End of chapter 26. In chapter 27 of Banking Under Difficulties by George Ogilvy Preshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Chapter 27. In May 1870, Thatcher, the well-known comic singer, paid a visit to Hokitika. His local songs, in which he brought in the names of most of the residents, were a great draw. He was particularly severe on a well-known Knight of the Hammer, who waited his time and had his revenge. The following extract is from the Tomahawk, a Saturday journal of criticism, commentary, and satire. But here another individual of extraordinary talents becomes interwoven with the thread of our narrative, and must share our consideration, being an offspring of Momus, and one of those mirth-provoking creatures that would never allow an opportunity to slip of raising a laugh, and sometimes the wind, at another's expense. This genius was a musician of the fal tol de riddle school, exquisitely clever on the Jew's harp, and assisted by a very unfortunate man, who would convulse his audience by vocal and instrumental sketches of our local celebrities, amongst whom was our worthy knight, who came in for his share. So continuous was this satire, often provoked, that a spirit of revenge was fired within his hitherto placid bosom. With the assistance of one who promised to see him through it, and a few more kindred spirits who had become immortalized by this comic minstrelsy, he resolved to repay these jokes and jibes with interest. And as this Terpsichorean was about to leave us to our original sober sadness, it was thought a fitting opportunity to carry this plot into execution. A handsome spread was prepared and laid out in compliment to the departing guest, and with him also were invited a large company of the élite of Hokitika, with the ostensible purpose of witnessing the presentation of a gold watch and appendages to the chief musician, whose musical talents had caused a furore in our quiet little town. Let us now contemplate the festive scene. A jovial party, after the toils of business, had assembled to enjoy one of those hilarious meetings that Englishmen so much appreciate. Gaily dressed was the apartment. Flags and flowers, at least of speech, were abundant. The viands were choice, whilst the wines, as they sparkled in the uplifted glasses, imparted an unusual glow to the countenances of the guests, animated, as they were, by the hearty merriment of the busy scene. The royal toast of Britons having been duly honoured, became the duty of the President to propose the health of this honoured guest. Bumpers were insisted on and drained with the utmost enthusiasm. The gift for presentation had all this while laid encased in front of the chairman, who now arose, and in a dignified and courteous speech deprecated his inability to do justice to the occasion, but desired this highly honoured individual to accept this small token of esteem, as a slight proof of the value at which they rated his flight of genius. Unopened, he received the proffered gift, with sundry protestations of gratitude for the unexpected tribute to his humble abilities, and declared that he would preserve it as a memorial of the kindness and support he had so abundantly received. Retiring to his chair, he proposed the health of the present company, when a few satirical remarks and sounds of suppressed laughter caused him to open the splendid jewel case, and to his great horror and surprise he discovered the trick played upon him. The gift was a child's toy, a mere gilt bauble. If the astonishment was great to the disappointed recipient, it was also great to the majority of the company. Only a few knew of the intended treachery, and those few kept their own counsel. Explanations were demanded, but not given, and the wandering minstrel put his toy in his pocket, remarking that it would please his little child as well as himself. Discontent soon became manifest, and the hilarity of the evening having become suddenly suspended, the company broke up, much dissatisfied with the abrupt termination of the evening's amusement. But the hoax was attributed, and it is thought justly, though not then present, to our friend the Knight of the Hammer. Bank clerks stationed on a goldfield do not, as a rule, save money. Their salaries will not allow them to do so. In the first place, on a rush, everything is very rough. They are compelled through the force of circumstances to live at a hotel, so-called. The billiard room is the only place of resort. A game of billiards is indulged in, first for the love of the thing, then for drinks for the good of the house. By and by he is induced to try his hand at pool. One thing leads to another, until he finds that his small salary is insufficient for his wants. Getting into arrears, he borrows money at a high rate of interest, and, gradually sinking deeper into debt, till in order to pay his debts of honour, he borrows some of the bank's money, no doubt intending to return it, when some day he is pounced upon unexpectedly by his manager or inspector. His cash is found short, he is dismissed from the service, or taken up on the charge of embezzlement and sentenced to a term of imprisonment. But there is an exception to this, as to every other rule. On the west coast there lived a bank clerk who arrived at a time when things were very rough, and when fully half his income would have gone in board alone had he lived at an hotel. This he determined not to do. How was he to manage? Where could he go? He soon solved the problem, overcoming the difficulty in this way. He purchased a 1/4 acre allotment in a back street, which was swampy, heavily timbered, in fact a most inhospitable-looking spot. On this he erected a 1-room cottage, in which he lived for several years. I did not make his acquaintance until he was leaving Hokitika, when I purchased his house and ground from him. When I went up to inspect it, I had a long chat with him. The cottage I found to be 10 feet by 14 feet. Facing the street was a door, a window on each side. These were pasted over with newspapers, which served the place of blinds. On the left as you entered was a fireplace, which was full of pots and pans. Over the fireplace was an oil painting of some relative of his, and other pictures, extracts of newspapers, and, what struck me as strange, several pieces about misers. In the centre of the room was an apology for a bedstead. This, he showed me. It was nothing but palings, no mattress, and very few blankets. Under the bed was a stock of potatoes and onions. At the right of the fireplace a large box containing a really valuable lot of books. Under one window a small table covered with odds and ends. Cords were stretched from one corner of the room to the other, on which were hanging coats, trousers, and all sorts of wearing apparel. Close to the back door, an iron tub and a sponge. Altogether as nice a litter as one could wish to see. He noticed me eyeing the place and said, "It's never been cleaned out since I came here." He then proceeded to give me his reason for living in this style. "When I arrived here," he said, "I found everything so dear. No place for a young fellow to live but at a public house, so I resolved to get a place of my own. Had no friends, and was determined to live sparingly and save sufficient money, so that if anything happened to me I would have something to fall back on. I built the house, fenced the ground, which I have trenched in places 10 or 12 feet deep, cut down the trees, which have kept me in firewood. All my spare time has been spent on the ground. I worked at it from daylight till breakfast, then I changed my clothes and went to the bank. As soon as my duties for the day were over, I would buy sufficient meat for tea and come home, changing my clothes and to work again. If it was raining, I would not get wet by degrees, but take a header into the creek, then work away until dark. When I came in, I would take off my wet clothes, have a sponge bath, and then take my tea. I knew no one and went nowhere. I've been here for 6 years, have got the ground into the order in which you see it, and I'm very sorry to part with it. I've gained my point. I was determined to save £1,000, and I've done it. My living has not cost me on an average more than 7 shillings 6pence per week." I was very much interested in this young man's story, in telling which he omitted to state that although living sparingly, grudging himself every pleasure in endeavouring to gain his object, he never turned a deaf ear to those in need of charity. Several instances came under my notice, when he was asked to subscribe to this charity or that, and in the most unostentatious manner put his name down for £1, £2, or £5, as the case may be, at the same time tendering his cheque for the amount. It may give some amusement to my readers to give a real, genuine love letter, which was passed from a would-be Benedict to a smiling Hebe. The first, an active man of about 4 feet 9 inches or 10 inches, weighing about 7 stone, to the second, who was a gay, buxom lass of 5 feet 8 inches, and stout in proportion, weighing at least 12 stone. The damsel did not wish to treat the offer lightly, but showed the epistle to her employer, who laughed at it. The original is now in my possession, and reads as follows. West Coast, Hokitika, Day 2 of June, 1870. 1. Miss Julie, I now take up my pen to write you an interesting letter, and I hope this interesting letter will find you, dearest Julie, in good health. Thanks to be they Lord for his goodness. Miss Julie, I must give you to understand that I have been informed that you are a single young woman, and also you are willing to take a husband in marriage. Miss Julie, I must give you to understand that I am a single young man, and I also must give you to understand that I intend for to settle down upon a piece of land near Hokitika and get married, so that, dearest Julie, I want you to let me know if you will consent to be my bride and get married to me, Miss Julie. And as I must give you to understand that I am going to the hotel to get answer from Mr. Hungerford about his ground and house. And I also must give you to understand, Miss Julie, that if Mr. Hungerford will not consent to agree to sell me his 20 acres of land and house 4 miles from Hokitika upon they same purchasing terms and conditions, as I must give you to know, Miss Julie, from me, that there is a gentleman in Hokitika who has offered to sell the 20 to 25 acres of land 4 miles from Hokitika upon they same purchasing terms and conditions, that I cannot let you know any more about they land till I see Mr. Hungerford. So, Miss Julie, I must give you to understand that you will never get a better match than George Ross Holmes for to join in matrimony with, as I must give you to know that I am sober steady young man. I must give you, Miss Julie, to know, Miss Julie, also that I am a native of Ireland, and also a Roman Catholic. And I must give you also to know, Miss Julie, that I am from the country Limerick in Ireland. Miss Julie, I thus give you to know I can turn my hand to any kind of work, as I am jack of all trades and master of one. Miss Julie, I must give you to know that I am by trade a practical gardener. I must conclude, as I have no more room. X. Miss Julie, as I do not know your other name, I must also give you to know that I understand how to shear. Also can drive. Seven horses in American wagon. I also can drive 8 working bullocks a dray. I can also plough up ground with horses. I can also build and save corn. Also can build up stacks of corn and then thatch them, and also can build sod houses and thatch them, and can also plaster all kinds of houses with lime plaster and cob plaster inside their houses or outside their houses. I also understand gold mining. Full stop. Miss Julie, I must give you to know from me that there is a young woman in Christchurch has offered to put £70 in my hand a week before getting married, if I will consent to become dear husband and get married to her. So, Miss Julie, if you do not consent to get married to me and become my bride, Miss Julie, I must give you to know that I will write to that young woman in Christchurch for to come up to me. I must give you to know, Miss Julie, that you ought to strike thy iron while it is hot, as a bird hand is worth 2 in thy bush. As it is not very day, Miss Julie, you will get a good mate in marriage like Mr. George Ross Holmes. So now good-bye, my dear, for the present. End of chapter 27. In chapter 28 of Banking Under Difficulties by George Ogilvy Preshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Chapter 28. Early Hokitika was situated on a sandy beach, overgrown with pine trees and undergrowth, through which it was scarcely possible to penetrate. Streets were gradually laid out and formed. A municipal corporation was soon established. Then streets were slowly improved, and now the corporation possesses many miles of well-made, clean, healthy streets. All the houses are built of wood, covered with iron, and consequently the whole town in the densely built parts is liable to destruction by fire. One such calamity occurred in 1869 through the careless use of kerosene, and a big gap was made in Revel Street. Much genuine sympathy was felt for the sufferers, and the handsome sum of about £900 was collected and distributed to the principal sufferers who had lost their means of earning a livelihood. At one time, nearly 200 public houses could be counted in Revel Street from the wharf to the Montezuma, a distance scarcely exceeding a mile in length. I suppose almost everyone who applied for a license to retail wines and spirits got it, as the fees were useful to the corporation. The corporation deserved credit for the administration of the rates. The money was well laid out, and the town has creditable streets to show for the expenditure. The treatment of criminals can also be favourably noticed. Able-bodied prisoners are employed in useful works of road-making and police improvements, and the value of each working prisoner's labour is set down against the expense of the prison establishment, and reckoned to be worth, on an average, about 2 shillings per diem. Their diet is regulated in some degree according to their work, and those that work and behave themselves are well treated and get good food. Among other useful pieces of work, they cleared the ground for a fine rifle range of 800 yards, leaving the original trees on each side standing, so that volunteers can practice whichever way the wind blows. In course of time, dwelling houses were built. At first, every man slept in a tent or at an hotel, and then little patches of gardens were formed, some for flowers, and others for the purpose of growing vegetables, at first scarce and dear. Some planted potatoes. Those on a terrace some distance back from the river and at a much higher elevation when they dug up their crops, dug up fish at the same time. A species of mudfish, Neochana apoda, which seems to burrow underground and leads a very retiring life. The pleasant villas and pretty flower gardens now to be found along Gibson's Quay fronting the river will do credit to a town of greater pretensions. Not only the streets of the town, but outlying districts are now connected, and buggies and conveyances can be driven considerable distances. To supply building materials, sawmills were erected, these to get suitable trees for cutting up and to make way into the bush with wooden tramways to bear in the logs. The tramways opened clearings into the forest and helped to prepare the ground near at hand for building purposes, and thus the town went eastward, because on the west it is bound by the sandy sea beach. I have already alluded to the discipline and order of the police force, and it may not be out of place to state that much of the credit of this was due to the efficiency and personal character of the first inspector, Mr. Thomas Brougham. The survivor of the Mongatapu murderers, the notorious Joseph Sullivan, acknowledged that the rest of the gang had to leave the coast, Mr. Brougham having made it too hot for them. But while complimenting the police and their inspector, it must be acknowledged that, generally speaking, a harder-working or more honest population it would be difficult to find. Nay, most of them were warm-hearted and unselfish. Witness the establishment of an efficient hospital, the claim of admission to which was only that a person was sick and required medical attendance. No doubt at times this worthy institution was imposed upon, but in innumerable instances the services rendered were invaluable. In 1865, when people from all parts flocked to Hokitika, and when all the population were housed in canvas tents, there were no roads or streets. The climate was considered severe, and many wanted in health for want of vegetables and proper food. But now that moderately comfortable houses have been built, and plentiful supplies of fresh meat and vegetables can be obtained, the climate is found to be extremely mild and equable. No doubt the rainfall is heavy, 120 inches per annum, but the rosy looks of the children running about the streets bring back earlier associations with Great Britain than a like comparison with the youth of any other colony in the southern hemisphere. From March 1865 to the end of 1869, the total yield of gold exported from the whole of the west coast to the middle island of New Zealand amounted to 1,719,749 ounces. Declared value, £6,878,996, or if the parcels that were known to have been surreptitiously shipped without paying duty be added, the totals may be set down as 1,750,000 ounces of the value of £7 million sterling, to a fluctuating population of about 10,000, and at one time about 50,000 at the most. The effect of so much wealth so suddenly acquired produced similar results as at the older goldfields of Victoria and New South Wales. Much of it was recklessly squandered in public houses, in dissipation and gambling, while many carefully hoarded their savings and were able to lay the foundations of future prosperity. There may be seen many who began with no capital save their own intelligence and forethought, who are now thriving citizens, respected for their industry and integrity, and who well deserve the success their early efforts have secured. Suburban and country lands have been cultivated with encouraging results. Much capital has been expended in hydraulic works of considerable magnitude, which have given remunerative returns to their proprietors. Flumes and water races many miles in length have been constructed, sometimes tunnelled through hills, and then carried for great distances across gullies and high trees to bring the hose to play on the auriferous dirt to enable the operator to recover the minute specks of precious metal. After the year 1869, the yield of gold decreased, and many of the diggers migrated to other fields. But the results of finding gold remain. The resources of the country are, to a moderate extent, developed, and an impetus given to future prosperity. In concluding my remarks on the progress of Hokitika and the West Coast generally, I shall briefly enumerate a few of the leading incidents that have occurred since the wild and apparently inhospitable shore was first invaded by bands of stalwart diggers. At first, tents were pitched on the beach, just above high water mark, amidst heaps of decayed trees, roots and stumps, torn up by spates, washed out to sea and tossed about in the tumbling surf until they had assumed all sorts of fantastic shapes. The site of the seaward part of the town was covered by masses of driftwood. Then officials arrived from Canterbury, and the question how to keep the bar clear was a puzzle to engineers, not settled even at this day. Groins and wing dams were constructed at considerable expense, and a line of wharfs on the riverbank called Gibson's Quay was built, at which schooners and steam vessels of light draught could be berthed. A municipal council was incorporated which did good service. The first mayor, Mr. J. A. Bonar, efficiently and gracefully filled that position when Sir George Grey, then the governor, visited the coast in 1867, and whom the citizens entertained at a banquet in the Theatre Royal. Mr. Bonar has since worthily and energetically discharged various offices of the highest trust and importance, and still retains the confidence of the inhabitants. In the early days of the occupation of the coast, when business was brisk and vessels were crowding to the port, I have seen many wrecks strewn along the beach. As soon as a vessel touches the bottom, the rolling surf beats it up high and dry. By means of expensive appliances, most of those ships which were strong and well formed were raised on ways and launched into the river when the tide was favourable. The squatters and farmers of Canterbury, being anxious for a market for their stock, pressed their government for a road to be made to the west coast, whither they could drive their fat cattle and surplus sheep. This road stands as a feat of engineering skill. On many of the passes through the mountains, the first surveyors and assistants had to be lowered and raised by ropes over perpendicular precipices, its cost exceeding £1,000,000 since it was first undertaken. The road was finished, and owing to the clamour for self-government, Westland was declared a county, with all the offices and paraphernalia of a little parliament. But self-government is a toy the people have almost got tired of playing with. The form has been altered several times, yet I am not sure that it gives even a reasonable amount of satisfaction. Since the Vogel government borrowed so liberally in the English market, many little pickings have come to Westland. Country roads, hitherto impassable, have been laid out and substantially constructed, and water races and harbour improvements have been made of a permanent character. Friendly benefit societies have been formed of the different orders that prevail in other colonies. These are in a thriving condition and are well and liberally supported. 2 tramways started from the west end of the town, both now unused, since the public roads were practicable for drays and horse traffic. Before the tramways were in operation, long strings of pack horses used to be the means of transporting supplies to the outlying districts. In the suburbs, pretty drives and shady walks are to be found. The trees are interlaced with climbing plants of great variety, and the undergrowth of mosses and exquisite ferns of singular grace and beauty. A person who is sure-footed enough to walk along a single wooden rail of, say, 3 inches wide, belonging to one of the sawmills, could penetrate to places in the forest full of charming interest that would well repay a walk. A walk along the sea beach is also enjoyable, and sometimes creatures of rare forms are thrown up at high water out of reach of the returning tide. At one time, a whale 56 feet long and 12 feet broad at the extension of the tail was found. A kangaroo fish, about 18 inches long, with legs and webbed feet like a frog, was found near the embouchure of the Terramako. Frost fish, hiku, of the Maoris, Lepidopus candatus, is esteemed the most delicious fish in New Zealand. These are sometimes found, but only on frosty mornings. It must be recalled that mails were carried along the beach to Greymouth when the tide was out, and the coach traversed the ground twice a day. Although the area of the country is considerable, there is only available a very insignificant portion fit for reclamation for agricultural pursuits. Yet energetic individuals struggle along under very trying difficulties. An exhibition of works of art, etc., was held in 1872, and showed a surplus after clearing all expenses. A second one was held at Christmas, 1873, which turned out a great success. the surplus fund being devoted to the establishment of a mineralogical museum. From public and private subscriptions, various prizes and medals were awarded to the successful exhibitors. The exhibits consisted of oil paintings, drawings, watercolours, photographs, curios, ladies' industrial, floricultural, horticultural, dairy produce, poultry, miscellaneous, including manufactures of bricks, leather, soap, ales, etc. Religious ordinances were soon observed. In the early part of 1866, the first minister arrived. He was a Roman Catholic priest who held service in a building adjoining the bank. Then ministers of other denominations, including the Bishop of Christchurch, who travelled overland and held service in the Corinthian Hall, followed. They were usually hard-working, devoted disciples of Christ, and were much esteemed for their zeal and untiring industry. There are now churches and chapels to satisfy the wants of the different creeds. There are also now efficient, well-conducted schools, where the young are fairly taught all the ordinary elements of education. Coal is found all along the coast. It is advantageously worked from the Buller to the Grey. Southwards, indications of coal are found, but they have not been turned to account yet. The coal turned out at the Grey is good for gas, as well as fuel and gas companies have been established at Greymouth and Hokitika, both paying satisfactory dividends. The country towards the Great Backbone, or Dividing Range, abounds in various mineral ores, which, when the country is better opened up, are likely to yield remunerative returns to enterprising adventurers. It should be borne in mind that the establishment of bank branches afforded to the diggers and business people settled along the different townships of the coast very tangible advantages. The diggers received full value for every ounce of gold they produced, and the traders had their cash and securities safely kept and ready at call when required. It is not too much to claim a small share of credit for the good management of banks which prevailed on the west coast. No encouragement was given to undue speculation, and each man's financial abilities were dealt with on their merits, and consequently business flowed and receded with quiet equanimity, and few failures of any magnitude occurred. As a rule, the bankers secured the goodwill and respect of the community. And now, my dear reader, I must say farewell. I trust you have realized the promises of my preface. I have nothing extenuated, nor have I set down aught in malice. On reperusing my diaries, I seem to live over again the life therein depicted. Past times are brought before me in panoramic succession, times that have left ineffaceable traces, I trust, of good on myself, my compeers, and on this my adopted country. With the expression of this hope I lay down my pen, avowing that at all times I have enjoyed greatly, have suffered greatly, both with those that loved me and alone. End of chapter 28. End of Banking Under Difficulties by George Ogilvy Preshaw.